She was just sitting quietly in the corner booth of the Rusty Anchor, nursing her second beer and minding her own business like she had every Friday for the past 6 months. Plain clothes, plain face, the kind of woman who blended into the background noise of clinking glasses and pool balls. But when Tommy Tank Rodriguez grabbed her shirt and tore it clean down the shoulder, exposing the ink carved deep into her skin, the entire bar went dead silent. That tattoo wasn't some trendy design. It was a mark earned in blood, in darkness, in places most people pray they'll never see. And every person in that Montana bar was about to learn that sometimes the quietest woman in the room carries the loudest thunder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Rusty Anchor Bar and Grill sat like a weathered monument on the edge of Riverside, Montana, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and the town's polite pretenses finally dropped their mask. It was the kind of establishment that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. Word of mouth traveled faster than gossip in a place where everybody knew everybody's truck, everybody's drinking habits, and everybody's business whether you wanted them to or not. The building itself had character beaten into its bones through decades of hard living. Wooden walls dark with age and cigarette smoke from back when smoking indoors was still legal, scarred floors that had seen more than their share of boot scuffs and blood stains, and windows so yellowed with time that the neon beer signs had to fight just to be seen from the parking lot. Sarah Martinez had been coming to the Rusty Anchor every Friday night for exactly 6 months, 2 weeks and 3 days though she wasn't counting. She'd chosen the same booth every time, the one tucked back in the far corner where the lighting was dim enough to read by but dark enough to disappear into. It wasn't the most comfortable seat in the house, with padding worn thin from years of supporting the weight of truckers, ranch hands and drifters who'd all left their own particular brand of wear and tear behind. But it offered something Sarah valued more than comfort. It offered invisibility. She'd perfected the art of being unremarkable over the years, dressed in clothes that could have come from any discount store in any small town across America. Faded blue jeans that fit well enough but didn't flatter, a plain gray sweater that covered everything from her collarbone to her wrists, and worn leather boots that looked like they'd walked a few thousand miles without complaint. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup except for the faint traces that remained from whatever she'd worn to her day job, and the kind of tired eyes that suggested someone who worked nights and slept when the rest of the world was getting started. To Frank Moretti, the bar's owner and a Vietnam veteran who'd seen his share of people trying to disappear into a bottle, Sarah was just another regular. She ordered the same thing every time, 2 bottles of Coors Light, nursed them slowly over the course of 3 hours, left a decent tip and never caused trouble. She didn't flirt with the truckers, didn't get drawn into the loud conversations that erupted around the pool table, and didn't seem to care about the local drama that kept everyone else entertained. She was background noise in human form, and in a place like the Rusty Anchor that was perfectly fine with everyone. Jake Sullivan, the 24-year-old bartender who'd been working there since he graduated from high school and never found a good enough reason to leave Riverside, had served Sarah probably 50 times and couldn't have told you her last name if his tip money depended on it. She was polite when she ordered, quiet when she drank, and invisible when she left. In a job where dealing with drunk cowboys, rowdy bikers, and the occasional domestic dispute came with the territory, invisible customers were a blessing he'd learned not to question. Amy Chen, the waitress who worked the Friday and Saturday night shifts to support her 8-year-old daughter, appreciated customers like Sarah for entirely different reasons. Sarah never grabbed at her when she walked by, never made crude comments about her figure, and never complained when the kitchen was running slow. She was the kind of customer who made the job bearable, a small island of calm in the weekly storm of testosterone and alcohol that defined weekend nights at the Rusty Anchor. But if Sarah thought she was truly invisible, she was only partly right. There were eyes that watched her, eyes that belonged to people who understood the difference between someone who was hiding and someone who was simply private. Frank Moretti, for instance, had noticed things about Sarah that others missed. The way she sat with her back to the wall and her face toward the door. The way her eyes swept the room periodically, not out of curiosity but out of habit. The way she held herself, straight-backed even when she was trying to slouch, like someone who'd been trained to maintain posture even when relaxing. These were details that meant nothing to most people, but Frank had spent 18 months in Vietnam learning to read people who didn't want to be read. He'd kept his observations to himself, partly out of respect for whatever privacy Sarah was trying to maintain, and partly because he'd learned that sometimes the most interesting stories belonged to people who worked hardest to keep them secret. He'd served enough veterans over the years to recognize the signs, though he couldn't have said exactly what branch of service or what kind of experience had left those particular marks on someone's bearing. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club had been making the Rusty Anchor their unofficial headquarters for the better part of 3 years, ever since their previous hangout burned down under circumstances that nobody talked about, and the insurance company was still investigating. They weren't the worst motorcycle club Frank had dealt with over his 22 years of owning the bar, but they weren't the most pleasant either. They spent money, they mostly kept their fights outside, and they understood the unspoken rules about not bothering the regular customers who just wanted to drink in peace. Tommy Tank Rodriguez had been the president of the Iron Wolves for 8 months, ever since the previous president had gotten himself arrested on federal drug charges, and would be spending the next 15 to 20 years learning about life in maximum security prison. Tank was 34 years old, built like someone who'd spent his teenage years throwing hay bales, and his adult years throwing punches, with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of a man who'd never backed down from anything, and wanted the world to know it. He had the kind of presence that changed the atmosphere of a room just by walking into it, not through violence, but through the promise of violence that seemed to follow him like cologne. The Iron Wolves weren't the biggest motorcycle club in Montana, but they'd earned their reputation through consistency rather than numbers. They dealt in stolen motorcycles, small-time drug running, and the kind of protection services that businesses paid for when they wanted problems to go away without involving law enforcement. Tank ran the club like a business, which meant keeping violence to a minimum, and profits at a maximum, but he also understood that respect in his world was earned through the occasional demonstration of what happened when that respect wasn't shown. On this particular Friday night, the bar was fuller than usual thanks to a combination of payday for the local ranch workers, and a 3-day weekend that had everyone feeling festive. The jukebox was playing classic rock loud enough to be heard over conversation. The pool table was busy enough that there was a line of quarters marking whose turn was next, and the air was thick with the smell of cigarettes, beer, and the kitchen's famous cheeseburgers that Frank's wife Maria had been perfecting for 2 decades. Sarah had arrived at her usual time, 8:30, ordered her usual drinks from Jake, and settled into her usual booth with the kind of routine that suggested someone who found comfort in predictability. She'd brought a paperback book, something that looked like it might have been borrowed from the library, and was reading while she drank, occasionally glancing up to watch the room but mostly keeping to herself. Tank and 5 other Iron Wolves had rolled up around 9:15, their Harley-Davidsons announcing their arrival with the kind of thunder that made conversation impossible, until the engines were turned off.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
They'd claimed their usual territory around the bar itself, ordering whiskey and beer, and settling into the kind of loud conversation that was equal parts business discussion and social posturing. For the first hour, both groups had coexisted in their separate spheres without incident. Sarah read her book, and worked on her first beer while Tank and his crew talked about motorcycle parts, upcoming rides, and which bars in neighboring towns were worth visiting, and which ones had gotten too friendly with local law enforcement. It was the kind of parallel existence that defined most nights at the Rusty Anchor, different tribes sharing the same space without necessarily acknowledging each other's existence. The trouble started when Marcus Diesel Thompson, Tank's lieutenant, and the kind of man who'd never met a confrontation he couldn't escalate, decided he needed to use the men's restroom and chose to take the long way around the room instead of the direct path. Diesel was drunk enough to be looking for entertainment, and sober enough to be dangerous, a combination that had gotten him into trouble more times than his arrest record reflected. He'd been walking past Sarah's booth, making a show of looking around the room like he owned it, when something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she was sitting so straight, Or maybe it was the fact that she hadn't looked up from her book when he walked by, but something about her struck him as disrespectful. In Diesel's worldview, respect was a zero-sum game. Anyone who didn't acknowledge his presence was automatically disrespecting it, and disrespect demanded a response. He'd stopped at her table, looming over her booth with the kind of intimidating presence that had worked on plenty of other people in plenty of other situations. When Sarah still didn't look up from her book, Diesel had cleared his throat loudly. When that didn't work, he tapped his knuckles against the table hard enough to make her beer bottles rattle. Finally, Sarah had looked up, not startled or nervous, but simply acknowledging his presence with the kind of calm attention that suggested someone who wasn't easily intimidated. She hadn't said anything, just made eye contact and waited to see what he wanted. But somehow, her calmness had made Diesel even angrier. He'd been expecting fear, or at least the kind of flustered surprise that most people showed when confronted by a large drunk biker. Instead, he'd gotten the kind of steady gaze that made him feel like he was being evaluated rather than feared. Tank had been watching the interaction from the bar, initially more amused than concerned. Diesel had a tendency to pick fights with people who couldn't fight back, and Tank generally let him get away with it as long as he didn't go too far. It was part of maintaining the club's reputation, and a little intimidation kept other customers from getting too comfortable around the Iron Wolves. But something about the way the woman in the corner booth was handling Diesel's attention had caught Tank's interest. Most people, when confronted by a drunk biker, who outweighed them by 60 pounds, and had arms like tree trunks, showed some kind of reaction. They got nervous, or angry, or tried to diffuse the situation with humor or submission. This woman was just sitting there, looking at Diesel like she was waiting for him to get to the point, and that kind of calm in a situation like this was unusual enough to be interesting. When Diesel had reached across the table, and grabbed Sarah's beer bottle, presumably to pour it over her head, or throw it against the wall or perform some other dramatic gesture designed to establish dominance, Tank had started moving toward the booth. Not because he was particularly concerned about the woman, but because property damage came out of the club's reputation credit with Frank, and Tank preferred to keep that balance positive. But before Tank could reach the booth, Diesel had escalated the situation beyond property damage, and into the kind of territory that would require a more serious response. Instead of going for the beer bottle, Diesel had grabbed Sarah's sweater at the shoulder and yanked hard enough to tear the fabric from her shoulder blade to her collarbone, exposing not just her bra strap but the intricate black ink that covered most of her left shoulder and wrapped around toward her back. The reaction was instantaneous and complete, not just from Tank, who stopped walking like he'd hit an invisible wall, but from every person in the bar who could see what Diesel had just revealed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Pool cues froze halfway through shots. Jake's hand stopped moving while he was wiping down a glass. Amy dropped the tray of empty bottles she'd been carrying, sending glass crashing to the floor in a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Because what Diesel had uncovered wasn't just a tattoo. It was a piece of military artwork that told a very specific story to anyone who knew how to read it. A paratrooper's wings, but not the standard version that thousands of soldiers earned every year. These were the kind of wings that came with additional qualifications, additional training, additional risks. Below the wings, a skull wearing a green beret, surrounded by a banner that read "De Oppresso Liber," to free the oppressed, the motto of the United States Army Special Forces. But even that wasn't what had stopped Tank cold, and made Frank Moretti move around the bar with more urgency than he'd shown in years. It was the smaller details, the things that most people wouldn't recognize but that told the real story to anyone who'd spent time in the military, or around people who had. The tiny numbers worked into the design that indicated not just Special Forces qualification, but specific unit assignments. The additional symbols that spoke of deployments, of operations, of the kind of service that didn't get talked about in polite company. Sarah Martinez, the quiet woman who'd been reading books and drinking beer in the corner booth for 6 months, was wearing the skin record of someone who'd jumped out of airplanes, into hostile territory, and done things that required security clearances most people didn't know existed. Tank Rodriguez had seen plenty of tattoos in his 34 years. His own arms were covered with them, each one marking a different chapter of his life, from his teenage years in East Los Angeles to his current position as president of the Iron Wolves. He'd grown up around veterans, men who'd served in Vietnam and Desert Storm, who carried their service on their skin in faded green and black ink that told stories of brotherhood, loss, and survival. He knew the difference between a tattoo someone got because they thought it looked cool, and one that had been earned through blood, sweat, and the kind of experiences that left permanent marks on a person's soul. What he was looking at on Sarah Martinez's exposed shoulder was definitely the latter. The artwork was precise, professional, the kind of work that came from military tattoo parlors, where accuracy mattered more than artistic flair. Every line was clean, every symbol placed with purpose, every detail carrying meaning that went far beyond decoration. The paratrooper's wings weren't just wings, they were the specific design that indicated airborne qualification, followed by additional specialized training that most people never heard about. The skull wearing the green beret wasn't just intimidating imagery, it was the official symbol of units that operated in shadows and silence, doing work that never made it into newspaper headlines or history books. But it was the smaller details that really caught Tank's attention, the things that required him to look closer than he was comfortable doing given the circumstances. Numbers that corresponded to specific deployments, symbols that indicated not just where someone had served but what kind of operations they'd participated in. A tiny set of crossed arrows that, if Tank's memory served him correctly from his own brief stint in the army, before he'd gotten himself discharged for fighting, indicated someone who'd completed SEER training. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The kind of training they gave to soldiers who were expected to operate behind enemy lines, and might find themselves captured, tortured, or worse. Sarah sat perfectly still in the booth, her torn sweater hanging off her shoulder, her tattoo exposed to the scrutiny of every person in the bar, who was now staring at her with a combination of shock, confusion, and growing respect. She didn't try to cover herself, didn't pull the fabric back into place, didn't show any sign of embarrassment or anger at having her privacy violated. She just sat there, calm and patient, like someone who'd been in more uncomfortable situations than having her clothing torn by a drunk biker in a Montana bar. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the faces of everyone who was staring at her, cataloging their reactions, assessing the situation with the kind of methodical attention that suggested someone who'd been trained to read rooms for threats and opportunities. When her gaze reached Tank, she held his eyes for a moment longer than the others, not challenging him but acknowledging that he was the authority figure in this particular moment, the person whose reaction would determine how the next few minutes played out. Tank found himself in the unusual position of not knowing exactly what to do. As the president of the Iron Wolves, he was expected to back up his members when they got into confrontations, especially with civilians who couldn't fight back. Diesel had been following standard protocol for dealing with disrespectful customers, and under normal circumstances, Tank would have supported whatever intimidation tactics Diesel chose to employ. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Sarah Martinez wasn't a normal civilian. Diesel himself seemed to be having a delayed reaction to what he'd uncovered. He'd been expecting to embarrass some quiet woman who thought she was too good to acknowledge his presence, maybe make her cry, or at least make her leave so that everyone in the bar would know not to disrespect the Iron Wolves. Instead, he'd revealed something that he didn't fully understand, but that he could tell was significant enough to change the entire atmosphere of the room. He stood there next to the booth, his hand still gripping the torn fabric of Sarah's sweater, looking like someone who'd opened what he thought was a jewelry box, and found a loaded gun inside. Frank Moretti was moving around the bar with more purpose than Tank had ever seen from the usually laid-back bar owner. Frank was a big man, not as big as Tank or Diesel, but solid enough to command respect, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of breaking up fights and managing difficult customers. But there was something different about the way he was moving now, something that suggested he wasn't just concerned about preventing a fight, but about protecting someone he suddenly realized deserved protection. Tank had heard stories about Frank's military service, though Frank himself never talked about it. Word around Riverside was that Frank had been some kind of military police in Vietnam, that he'd seen action in places that weren't supposed to exist and done things that weren't supposed to be talked about. Looking at Frank's face now, Tank was beginning to think those stories might have been more accurate than he'd previously believed. Amy Chen had stopped trying to clean up the broken bottles, and was instead standing behind the bar next to Jake, both of them staring at Sarah like they were seeing her for the first time. Jake looked confused, like someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Amy looked thoughtful, like pieces were starting to fit together in ways that explained things she'd noticed, but never understood. Officer Rita Kowalski, who'd been playing pool with two off-duty ranch hands when the confrontation started, had put down her cue stick and was moving closer to the scene with the kind of careful attention that cops developed when situations started moving from routine to potentially dangerous. Rita was a 10-year veteran of the Riverside Police Department and had dealt with the Iron Wolves enough times to know how these situations usually played out. But something about the way everyone was reacting told her this wasn't going to be a usual situation. The silence in the bar was becoming uncomfortable, the kind of quiet that stretched too long and started to create its own tension. Someone needed to say something, do something, break the spell that had fallen over the room when Diesel had exposed Sarah's tattoo. Tank realized that as the ranking authority figure among the bikers, the responsibility fell to him to either escalate the situation or find a way to de-escalate it without losing face. He looked at Sarah again, really looked at her this time, trying to reconcile the quiet woman who'd been sitting in the corner booth with the person whose military service record was literally written on her skin. She was probably in her mid-30s, though it was hard to tell exactly. Her face had the kind of weathered quality that came from spending time outdoors in harsh conditions, but her hands looked soft enough that whatever rough work she'd done was probably in the past. She was smaller than he'd initially thought, maybe 5'6", and probably not more than 140 pounds, but she carried herself like someone who was comfortable with her own physical capabilities. More importantly, she was looking at him like someone who wasn't afraid of him, wasn't intimidated by him, and wasn't particularly concerned about what he might choose to do next. That kind of calm confidence was unusual enough in anyone, but especially in someone who was significantly outweighed and outnumbered by potential opponents. It suggested either complete naivety about the danger she might be in, or complete confidence in her ability to handle whatever danger might come her way. Tank was beginning to suspect it was the latter. Diesel finally released his grip on Sarah's torn sweater and took a step back from the booth, though whether that was from some dawning awareness that he'd made a mistake, or simply from confusion about what to do next was unclear. He looked at Tank expectantly, waiting for guidance about how to proceed, clearly hoping that Tank would provide some kind of direction that would allow him to save face after what was starting to look like a significant miscalculation. But Tank was dealing with his own miscalculations. He'd allowed Diesel to intimidate what he'd assumed was a harmless civilian, and now he was looking at evidence that the harmless civilian was actually someone who'd probably faced down more dangerous opponents than a drunk biker in a Montana bar. The smart move would be to find a way to withdraw gracefully, maybe even apologize for Diesel's behavior, and pretend the whole thing had never happened. The problem was that backing down in front of the entire bar, especially after one of his own members had initiated a confrontation, would damage his reputation, and the club's reputation in ways that could have serious consequences. The Iron Wolves maintained their position in Riverside's criminal ecosystem through a combination of actual capability and perceived strength. If word got out that they'd backed down from a confrontation with a woman sitting alone in a bar booth, it would encourage other people to test their limits and potentially lead to more serious challenges to their authority. Sarah seemed to understand the position Tank was in, because she finally spoke for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Her voice was quiet but clear, with the kind of controlled tone that suggested someone who was used to being heard even when she wasn't speaking loudly. "There's no need for this to go any further," she said,
addressing Tank rather than Diesel, acknowledging the chain of command that governed the Iron Wolf's internal dynamics. Your friend got a little too aggressive, but no real damage was done. I'd appreciate it if you could keep him from touching me again, but I'm not looking for trouble. Her tone was respectful, but not submissive, offering Tank a way to resolve the situation without anyone losing face, while also making it clear that she expected the harassment to stop. It was the kind of diplomatic language that suggested someone who'd been trained in conflict resolution, who understood how to give potential opponents a way to withdraw without feeling humiliated. Tank found himself impressed despite the circumstances. Sarah was handling a potentially volatile situation with more skill than most people would have managed, showing respect for his authority, while also setting clear boundaries about what she would and wouldn't tolerate. It was the kind of response that suggested someone who dealt with similar situations before, who understood the dynamics of power and respect and knew how to navigate them successfully. But it also created a new problem for Tank, because accepting her offer to let the matter drop would require him to acknowledge that his member had been in the wrong, and that Sarah was being generous by not demanding more serious consequences. That kind of acknowledgement would shift the power dynamic in ways that could be dangerous for the club's reputation. Frank Moretti reached Sarah's booth just as she finished speaking, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he wasn't planning to let Tank wrestle with his decision much longer. Frank had been watching the situation develop with growing concern, and now that he'd gotten a good look at Sarah's tattoo, he understood exactly what kind of person Diesel had just decided to mess with. "Everything okay over here?" Frank asked, though his tone made it clear he was asking Sarah rather than Tank or Diesel. It was a subtle but significant shift in the usual dynamics of these kinds of confrontations, where bar owners typically deferred to the bikers who brought in steady money, and tried to avoid taking sides in disputes with other customers. Sarah nodded at Frank, giving him the kind of look that suggested she appreciated his concern, but didn't need his protection. "Just a misunderstanding," she said. "I think we're working it out." But Frank wasn't satisfied with that answer. He'd gotten a good enough look at Sarah's tattoo to understand that she was someone who deserved more respect than she'd been getting, and he was feeling guilty about all the nights he'd served her beer without recognizing what she'd probably sacrificed for her country. More than that, he was angry at Diesel for putting his bar in the position of hosting what could easily turn into a much more serious confrontation. "Diesel," Frank said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of running a business that catered to dangerous people, "you need to apologize to the lady for tearing her clothes." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Diesel looked at Frank with the kind of surprise that suggested he'd never been asked to apologize to anyone for anything, especially not by a bar owner who was supposed to mind his own business when the Iron Wolves were handling club matters. Tank felt the situation escalating in ways that he wasn't sure he could control, caught between his responsibility to back up his member and his growing understanding that his member had made a serious mistake. Sarah looked around the room again, taking in the faces that were still staring at her, the tension that was building between Frank and the bikers, the potential for violence that was growing with each passing moment. She seemed to come to some kind of decision, because she
reached up and carefully pulled the torn edges of her sweater back together, covering her tattoo and returning her appearance to something resembling normal. "It's fine," she said firmly, making eye contact with Frank. "Really, no apology necessary." But even as she said it, everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had changed. The quiet woman in the corner booth wasn't just a quiet woman anymore. She was someone with a history, someone with training, someone who'd earned the right to be treated with respect whether she demanded it or not. And now everyone knew it. Tank looked at his watch and realized they'd been standing around Sarah's booth for almost 10 minutes, long enough for the entire bar to get a good look at what Diesel had uncovered and form their own opinions about what it meant. The damage to his club's reputation from backing down might be significant, but the damage from prolonging a confrontation with someone who might turn out to be more dangerous than she appeared could be even worse. He made his decision. "Diesel," Tank said quietly, "we're leaving." Diesel looked at him with surprise, and what might have been the beginning of an argument. But Tank's expression made it clear that the decision wasn't up for discussion. Tank had been in enough fights to recognize when he was looking at someone who knew how to handle themselves, and everything about Sarah's demeanor suggested that any physical confrontation would not go the way Diesel seemed to expect. More importantly, Tank was beginning to suspect that Sarah Martinez wasn't just some former soldier who'd gotten lucky with her tattoo placement. The specific symbols on her shoulder, the way she'd handled the confrontation, the respect she was getting from Frank Moretti, who didn't show respect to anyone he hadn't earned it from, all suggested that Sarah was someone who'd done the kind of military service that came with skills most people didn't want to test. As the Iron Wolves gathered their leather jackets and prepared to leave the Rusty Anchor, Tank took one more look at Sarah, who was now calmly sipping her beer like nothing had happened. She met his eyes and nodded slightly, acknowledging his decision to withdraw without making him feel like he was retreating in defeat. But Tank knew, and everyone else in the bar knew, that this wasn't really over. Word would spread about what had happened tonight, about the quiet woman with the Special Forces tattoo, about the confrontation that had ended without violence but with everyone understanding that violence had definitely been a possibility. Sarah Martinez had spent 6 months being invisible in Riverside, Montana, but her invisibility had just come to an end, and Tank had the uncomfortable feeling that the consequences of that change were going to reach far beyond one night at the Rusty Anchor. The aftermath of the Iron Wolves' departure settled over the Rusty Anchor like dust after a windstorm. Conversations slowly resumed, but they carried a different quality now, hushed tones and sideways glances that all seemed to gravitate toward the corner booth where Sarah Martinez sat finishing her second beer as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The torn fabric of her sweater had been carefully arranged to maintain her modesty, but everyone in the bar had seen what lay beneath it, and that knowledge changed everything about how they perceived the woman who'd been part of their Friday night routine for months. Jake Sullivan found himself wiping down the same section of the bar for the third time, his eyes constantly drifting towards Sarah's booth. In the 6 months he'd been serving her, he'd never given much thought to who she might be beyond her drink order and her reliable tipping habits. Now he was replaying every interaction they'd had, looking for clues he might have missed, signs that should have told him he was serving someone who'd done things most people only saw in movies. The way she always said please and thank you, never demanding or impatient even when the bar was crowded and service was slow. The way she never seemed surprised by anything, never startled when someone dropped a glass or raised their voice. The way she moved through the bar's chaos like someone who was used to keeping calm in much more serious situations. Amy Chen had finished cleaning up the broken bottles but found herself lingering near Sarah's section of the bar, ostensibly checking on other tables but really trying to process what she'd witnessed. Amy had grown up in a military family before her father's job brought them to Montana, and she'd spent enough time around soldiers to recognize the difference between someone who'd served in a support role and someone who'd seen actual combat. The tattoo on Sarah's shoulder told a story of the latter, detailed enough that Amy was beginning to understand why Sarah had always seemed so unimpressed by the various forms of trouble that regularly erupted in the Rusty Anchor. Amy thought about all the Friday nights she'd watched Sarah read her books while drunk cowboys argued over pool games, while truckers got increasingly loud about politics, while various groups of young men tried to prove their toughness through increasingly stupid demonstrations of bravado. Sarah had never reacted to any of it, never seemed concerned or entertained or even particularly interested. Amy had assumed it was because Sarah was antisocial or maybe just tired from whatever day job kept her busy. Now she was beginning to suspect it was because Sarah had been in situations where real danger was involved, where the stakes were actual life and death rather than hurt feelings and wounded pride. Frank Moretti had returned to his position behind the bar, but his attention kept drifting to Sarah's booth with the kind of protective awareness that suggested he was rethinking everything he thought he knew about his regular customer. Frank had served plenty of veterans over the years, and he'd developed a sense for the ones who'd seen serious action. There was a particular quality to their stillness, a way of watching without appearing to watch, of being present in a room while also being ready to leave it quickly if circumstances required. Sarah had always displayed those qualities, but Frank had attributed them to shyness or social anxiety rather than military training. Now that he'd seen her tattoo, Frank was remembering details that suddenly made more sense. The way Sarah always chose the booth that offered clear sightlines to both the front entrance and the back exit. The way she never sat with her back to the room's main traffic pattern. The way she never seemed surprised by sudden noises or movements, as if some part of her mind was always cataloging potential threats even when she appeared to be absorbed in reading. These were behaviors Frank recognized from his own military service, habits that combat veterans developed and never quite lost even decades after they'd returned to civilian life. But Frank's service in Vietnam had been primarily as military police, dealing with discipline problems and criminal investigations rather than the kind of direct action that Sarah's tattoo suggested. The symbols and qualifications represented on her shoulder spoke of training and operations that went far beyond anything Frank had experienced, and he found himself feeling both impressed and slightly intimidated by the realization that he'd been casually serving beer to someone who'd probably been involved in missions he wasn't even supposed to know existed. Officer Rita Kowalski had returned to her pool game, but her attention was divided between lining up shots and observing Sarah with the kind of professional interest that 10 years of police work had developed in her. Rita had dealt with plenty of veterans in her job, both as victims and as suspects, and she'd learned to recognize the signs of someone who'd been trained to handle violence. Sarah displayed those signs in subtle but unmistakable ways: the controlled movement, the constant situational awareness, the calm reaction to stress that suggested someone who'd been in much more dangerous situations than a confrontation with drunk bikers. What interested Rita most was how Sarah had handled the situation with Diesel and Tank. Most civilians, when confronted by aggressive bikers, either became confrontational themselves or tried to appease their way out of trouble. Sarah had done neither. She'd remained calm, assessed the situation, and found a way to de-escalate the confrontation while allowing everyone involved to save face. That kind of diplomatic skill, combined with the obvious military training represented by her tattoo, suggested someone who'd been trained not just in combat operations but in the kind of complex situations where shooting wasn't an option, and success depended on reading people and managing relationships. Rita made a mental note to run Sarah's name through the police databases when she got back to the station, not because she suspected Sarah of any wrongdoing, but because she was curious about what kind of background check would turn up. She had a feeling it would be either completely clean or completely classified, with nothing in between. The pool game Rita had been playing resumed with less enthusiasm than before. Her opponents, both ranch workers who'd known each other since high school, found themselves glancing toward Sarah's booth and discussing in low voices what they'd witnessed. One of them, a man named Carlos who'd done 2 tours in Iraq as an army mechanic, was trying to explain to his friend what the different elements of Sarah's tattoo meant and why they were significant. "That's not just any paratrooper wings," Carlos was saying, keeping his voice low enough that Sarah wouldn't overhear. "Those are the kind you get after you've done additional training, specialized stuff. And that green beret skull, that's special forces. That's like Navy SEALs or Delta Force level training. Those people don't just learn how to fight, they learn languages and cultures and how to operate in foreign countries where nobody's supposed to know they exist." His friend, a man named Dave, who'd never served in the military but had grown up watching war movies, was having trouble reconciling what Carlos was telling him with the quiet woman in the corner booth. "She doesn't look like Rambo," he said, not disparagingly but with genuine confusion. Carlos laughed quietly. "That's the point. The people who do that kind of work, they're trained to blend in, to look like normal civilians. If she looked like a Hollywood action hero, she wouldn't be very good at her job. The fact that she's been sitting in here for months without anybody knowing what she was, that's probably exactly what she was trained to do." Their conversation was interrupted by Rita, who had been listening while pretending to focus on her next shot. "You two need to keep your voices down," she said quietly but firmly. "And you need to stop speculating about things that aren't your business." If she wanted people to know about her background, she wouldn't have been keeping it quiet for 6 months. Carlos nodded, understanding that Rita was right but still fascinated by the revelation.
It's just you wonder what someone like that is doing in a place like Riverside. I mean, with skills like that she could probably be working for the government or private security companies, making serious money. Instead she's here drinking beer alone on Friday nights. Dave, who despite his lack of military experience had enough life experience to understand that people didn't always end up where they expected to be, shrugged. Maybe she's here for the same reason the rest of us are here. Maybe this is where she ended up, and she's making the best of it. Rita appreciated Dave's perspective, but she suspected the reality was more complicated than that. In her experience, people with Sarah's apparent background didn't just randomly end up in small Montana towns unless they were running from something or looking for something specific. The fact that Sarah had maintained such a low profile for so long suggested that whatever had brought her to Riverside, she'd been intentionally trying to avoid drawing attention to herself. The question that interested Rita was whether Sarah's desire for anonymity was about avoiding her past or protecting her present. Some veterans struggled with reintegrating into civilian life and chose small towns and quiet lifestyles as a way of managing the transition. Others were dealing with post-traumatic stress or other service-related issues that made crowds and noise and social interaction difficult. But some were hiding from people or situations connected to their military service, and those cases were often more complicated and potentially more dangerous. At the bar itself, conversation had gradually shifted from the immediate drama of the confrontation to speculation about what it meant and what might happen next. The regulars who'd witnessed the exchange between Sarah and the Iron Wolves were processing it in different ways depending on their own backgrounds and perspectives. A trucker named Mike, who'd been coming to the Rusty Anchor for 15 years and considered himself something of an expert on local dynamics, was explaining to anyone who'd listen why he thought the bikers had made a serious mistake. "Tank's not stupid," Mike was saying, nursing his third beer and enjoying having an audience for his analysis. "He knows the difference between someone he can push around and someone who might push back. The way he backed down so quick, that tells you everything you need to know about what he saw in that tattoo." An older man named Pete, who'd been sitting at the end of the bar nursing a whiskey and mostly keeping to himself, spoke up for the first time all evening. "My nephew did 2 tours in Afghanistan," Pete said quietly. "Army Rangers. He came back different, quiet, always watching people, always thinking about things the rest of us don't think about. But he told me once that the Rangers were like Boy Scouts compared to some of the other units over there. Special Forces Delta, those Navy SEAL teams. He said those people did things that didn't make it into the news reports." The bar got quiet as Pete continued. He said the scariest thing about some of those operators was that you'd never know what they were capable of just by looking at them. They were trained to look like regular people, to blend in, to be invisible until they needed to not be invisible anymore. Pete glanced toward Sarah's booth, then back at his whiskey. "Makes you wonder what that lady's story is. Makes you wonder what she's doing in Riverside, and whether maybe there's a reason she's been keeping so quiet all this time." Frank, who'd been listening to the conversation while pretending to be busy with inventory, finally spoke up. "Maybe," he said carefully, "we should all remember that whatever her story is, it's her story to tell or not tell as she chooses. She's been a good customer, never caused any trouble, always treated everyone with respect. Far as I'm concerned, that's all that matters." But even as Frank said it, he knew the situation had changed permanently. Sarah's anonymity had been shattered, and there was no way to put that particular genie back in the bottle. Word would spread beyond the bar, would travel through Riverside's interconnected network of gossip and speculation, would reach people who might have their own reasons for being interested in someone with Sarah's apparent background. Frank found himself hoping that whatever had brought Sarah to Riverside, whatever she was trying to escape or forget or leave behind, it wouldn't follow her here. But he'd been around long enough to know that the past had a way of catching up with people, especially people who'd lived the kind of past that Sarah's tattoo suggested. Sarah herself seemed oblivious to the increased attention she was receiving, or at least she was doing an excellent job of pretending to be oblivious. She'd finished her second beer and was reading her book again, occasionally turning pages with the kind of steady rhythm that suggested genuine engagement with the text rather than nervous fidgeting. But Jake noticed that she was checking her watch more frequently than usual, and Amy observed that her eyes were moving around the room more often, subtle but regular sweeps that took in every corner of the bar and everyone in it. The difference was that now, when Sarah's eyes swept the room, people noticed. Where once her glances had been invisible, routine parts of the background noise of the bar, now they carried weight and significance. Everyone was aware of being observed by someone who clearly knew how to observe, who'd been trained to notice details and assess situations, and make judgments about people and circumstances. It was an uncomfortable feeling for some of the bar's patrons, being suddenly visible to someone they'd never really thought about before. The realization that Sarah had been watching them all along, cataloging their behavior and relationships and routines without their knowledge, made them feel exposed in ways they didn't quite understand. But it also made them feel safer, in a strange way. The knowledge that someone with Sarah's training and experience had been present during all those Friday nights when tempers flared and situations got out of hand, had been available if things had gone too far, was oddly comforting. It was like discovering that there had been a security guard they'd never noticed, a professional, who'd been quietly ensuring that nothing too dangerous happened in their regular gathering place. Sarah closed her book and stood up, pulling a $20 bill from her pocket, and placing it on the table next to her empty bottles. It was her usual tip, generous but not ostentatious, the same amount she'd been leaving every Friday for months. But somehow tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a statement, a confirmation that despite everything that had happened, despite having her privacy violated and her background exposed, she was still the same person who'd been quietly showing respect for the people who worked at the Rusty Anchor. As she walked toward the door, conversations paused and eyes followed her progress through the room. Not the predatory attention she'd sometimes receive from drunk customers, but the respectful acknowledgement that people gave to someone they'd suddenly realized deserved their respect. Sarah nodded to Frank as she passed the bar, a simple gesture of thanks for his intervention earlier, and Frank nodded back with the kind of understanding that passed between people who both served their country in different ways and different times. At the door, Sarah paused and looked back at the room one more time. It wasn't a threatening look or a challenging look, just a final assessment of the situation she was leaving behind. Then she pushed through the door and disappeared into the Montana night, leaving behind a bar full of people who were still processing what they'd learned about the woman they'd been ignoring for 6 months. Outside in the parking lot, Sarah took a deep breath of the cool night air and looked up at the stars that were visible beyond the reach of Riverside's modest light pollution. She'd known this day would come eventually, had known that her carefully constructed anonymity wouldn't last forever. There were too many ways for the past to surface, too many people who might recognize the signs she carried, too many opportunities for the kind of mistake Diesel had made tonight. But she'd hoped for more time to figure out what came next, more time to decide whether Riverside was a place she could stay permanently, or just another temporary stop in a journey that had already taken her to too many places. More time to prepare for whatever consequences came from having her background exposed to people who might not understand what it meant or who might understand it all too well. Sarah walked to her truck, a 10-year-old Ford pickup that was reliable and unremarkable, and fit perfectly with her carefully cultivated image as someone who worked with her hands and didn't have money for anything fancy. As she drove through Riverside's quiet streets toward the small apartment she rented above the old hardware store, she found herself thinking about what would happen next. Word would spread, that much was certain. By tomorrow afternoon, half the town would know about the confrontation at the Rusty Anchor, and by the end of the weekend, everyone would have heard some version of the story about the quiet woman with the military tattoo who'd faced down the iron wolves. Most of the stories would be exaggerated, some of them would be completely inaccurate, but all of them would make it impossible for Sarah to maintain the low profile she'd worked so hard to establish. The question was whether that loss of anonymity would bring the kind of attention she'd been trying to avoid, or whether it might actually make her life in Riverside easier in some ways. There were advantages to being known and respected, even if that respect came with unwanted scrutiny and expectations. People would be less likely to bother her, less likely to assume she was vulnerable or easy to intimidate. But they'd also be more likely to ask questions, more likely to dig into her background, more likely to discover things she'd worked hard to keep buried. As Sarah pulled into the alley behind her apartment building and parked her truck in the same spot she'd been using for months, she made a decision. She'd been running from her past for long enough, moving from town to town and job to job whenever things got too complicated or too dangerous or too familiar. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to see if Sarah Martinez could build a real life in Riverside, Montana, even if that life came with complications she hadn't planned for. But first she had to figure out who else might have noticed what happened tonight, and whether any of them posed the kind of threat that would force her to disappear again, just when she was starting to think she might be able to stay. Sarah's apartment above Henderson's hardware store was as carefully unremarkable as everything else about her life in Riverside. The building dated back to the 1940s, when the town's main street had been lined with thriving businesses that served the surrounding ranching communities. Most of those businesses were gone now, replaced by empty storefronts, or converted into services that reflected Montana's changing economy. Henderson's hardware had survived by adapting, carrying everything from traditional ranch supplies to the kind of suburban lawn care equipment that newer residents needed for their half-acre lots on Riverside's expanding edges. The apartment itself was a one-bedroom space with hardwood floors that creaked in predictable patterns, windows that faced both Main Street and the alley behind the building, and enough room for someone who didn't accumulate unnecessary possessions. Sarah had furnished it with items from the local thrift store, and a few practical pieces she'd bought new when she couldn't find adequate used alternatives. A comfortable reading chair positioned to provide sight lines to both the front and back entrances, a small dining table that doubled as a desk, a bed frame that didn't squeak, and a mattress that supported the kind of sleep that could be interrupted without leaving her disoriented. The rent was reasonable, the utilities were included, and old Mr. Henderson, who owned the building, was the kind of landlord who fixed problems quickly and didn't ask questions about tenants who paid on time and kept to themselves. Sarah had chosen the place specifically because it offered multiple exit routes, because the neighboring buildings provided cover if she needed to leave unnoticed, and because Main Street's regular traffic patterns meant that one more person coming and going wouldn't attract attention. But as she climbed the external staircase that led to her apartment door, Sarah was acutely aware that her carefully constructed anonymity had been shattered in ways that might make all those security considerations irrelevant. The confrontation at the Rusty Anchor had exposed not just her tattoo but her training, her capabilities, and her instinct for managing dangerous situations. Word would spread through Riverside's interconnected network of relationships and gossip, and by Monday morning, everyone in town would know that the quiet woman who worked nights at the community college was someone with a very different kind of background than they'd assumed. Inside her apartment, Sarah went through her usual evening routine with the kind of methodical attention that had become second nature over years of living in temporary situations. She checked the locks on both doors, confirmed that the windows were secure but could be opened quickly if necessary, and verified that the emergency bag she kept packed and hidden behind the water heater hadn't been disturbed. These were habits she'd developed during years of moving from place to place, never quite sure when circumstances might require her to disappear quickly and start over somewhere else. But tonight, as she went through the familiar motions, Sarah found herself questioning whether those precautions were still necessary, or whether it was time to acknowledge that running from her past hadn't solved any of the fundamental problems that had driven her to leave her old life behind. She'd been in Riverside for almost 7 months, longer than she'd stayed anywhere since leaving the military, and despite her efforts to remain invisible, she'd begun to develop the kind of connections that made a place feel like home rather than just another temporary stop. There was her job at Riverside Community College, where she worked the night shift cleaning classrooms and offices for an administration that appreciated her reliability and her discretion about the various dramas that played out in academic settings. The work wasn't challenging, But it was honest and it paid enough to cover her modest expenses while allowing her to avoid the kind of employment that required extensive background checks or security clearances. More importantly, it gave her something to do with her time that felt useful without demanding more engagement than she was prepared to offer. There were her Friday nights at the Rusty Anchor, which had started as a way to monitor the local social dynamics and assess potential threats, but had gradually evolved into something that felt almost like belonging. Frank Moretti's quiet respect for her privacy, Jake Sullivan's friendly efficiency, Amy Chen's professional competence in dealing with difficult customers, even the predictable rhythms of the various regulars who gathered there each week. Sarah had found herself looking forward to those evenings, not because she was particularly social, but because they provided a sense of routine and community that she'd been missing since leaving the military. And there were the small daily interactions that had begun to feel like relationships rather than just transactions. Mrs. Kowalski from the grocery store, who always asked about her weekend plans and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. Tom Henderson, who'd started leaving small improvements in her apartment without being asked. A better reading light here, a more secure lock there, the kind of attention that suggested he viewed her as a valued tenant rather than just a source of monthly income. Even Dr. Patricia Williams from the community college, who'd made a point of stopping by during Sarah's shifts to chat about books and current events with the kind of intellectual engagement Sarah had been missing. These connections weren't deep or complicated, but they represented something Sarah hadn't experienced since her military service ended, the possibility of building a life that was based on who she was rather than who she was trying not to be. For months she'd been testing whether it might be possible to be Sarah Martinez, night janitor and Friday evening regular at the local bar, instead of constantly being the person she'd been trained to be in situations where survival depended on skills most civilians never needed to develop. Tonight's events at the Rusty Anchor had answered that question definitively. There was no going back to being invisible, no pretending that her background was irrelevant to who she was in Riverside. The only question now was whether she could find a way to integrate her past with her present, or whether the exposure would force her to disappear and start over somewhere else. Sarah made herself a cup of tea and settled into her reading chair with the book she'd been carrying at the bar, though she found it difficult to concentrate on the story when her own story was suddenly so uncertain. Through her front window, she could see Main Street's modest nighttime activity, the occasional car passing through town, the lights from the 24-hour diner where late-shift workers grabbed
coffee and conversation, the patrol car that made its routine rounds through the business district. It was the kind of peaceful small-town scene that had initially attracted her to Riverside. The promise of a place where dramatic events were rare, and most problems could be solved through community cooperation rather than force. But Sarah's military experience had taught her that peaceful scenes could change quickly when the wrong kind of attention was focused on them. The Iron Wolves weren't just a local motorcycle club. They were connected to larger networks of people who traded in information as well as drugs and stolen goods. Tank Rodriguez might have chosen to withdraw from tonight's confrontation, but he'd also gotten a good look at her tattoo and would remember what he'd seen. If he was curious enough to ask the right people the right questions, he might learn things about Sarah's background that went far beyond what was visible on her shoulder. More concerning was the possibility that other people had noticed what happened at the Rusty Anchor, people who might have their own reasons for being interested in someone with Sarah's apparent qualifications. Riverside was small enough that news traveled fast, but it was also located along transportation routes that brought through travelers who weren't part of the local community. Truckers, tourists, business travelers, and others who might recognize the significance of what they'd witnessed and carry that information to places where it could attract unwanted attention. Sarah had been careful during her time in Riverside to avoid the kind of employment or activities that might draw attention from federal agencies or private contractors who recruited people with her background. She'd turned down opportunities that would have paid better but required security clearances, had avoided situations that might have brought her into contact with current or former military personnel who might recognize her, had chosen a lifestyle that was deliberately ordinary and unremarkable. But all those precautions were meaningless if her cover had been blown in such a public and memorable way. As she sipped her tea and tried to assess the situation objectively, Sarah found herself thinking about the choices she'd made that had brought her to this point. After leaving the military, she'd spent 2 years trying to reintegrate into civilian life in ways that utilized her training and experience. She'd worked for private security companies, had taken contracts that involved protecting executives in dangerous locations, had even done some consulting work for government agencies that needed people with her particular skill set. But every job had come with complications that reminded her why she'd chosen to leave military service in the first place. The work attracted people who were addicted to adrenaline and violence, who viewed conflict as entertainment rather than tragedy. The clients were often wealthy individuals or corporations whose problems stemmed from their own poor decisions or ethical failures. And the missions, while legal and profitable, felt increasingly disconnected from the ideals that had motivated her to serve her country in the first place. More troubling had been the realization that her reputation in certain circles was becoming well known enough to attract attention from people she'd hoped never to encounter again. Former colleagues who'd taken darker paths after leaving the military. Intelligence operatives who viewed her as either an asset to be recruited or a liability to be managed. Criminal organizations that were always looking for people with specialized skills and few moral constraints. Sarah had left that world behind when she realized that her training and experience, which had once been tools for serving something larger than herself, were becoming a trap that defined her relationships and limited her options. She'd chosen anonymity and ordinary work not because she was afraid of challenge or responsibility, but because she wanted to discover who she might be when her identity wasn't entirely defined by her capacity for violence. Riverside had offered the possibility of that discovery, and for 7 months she'd been exploring what it meant to be valued for reliability rather than lethality, to be respected for consistency rather than capability in crisis situations. She'd been learning to find satisfaction in small accomplishments and simple relationships, to appreciate the kind of peace that came from knowing that her presence in a community was entirely positive rather than potentially dangerous. Tonight's events hadn't just exposed her background, they'd reminded her of aspects of herself that she'd been trying to leave behind. The way she'd automatically assessed the tactical situation when Diesel had grabbed her sweater. The speed with which she'd identified potential weapons and escape routes when the confrontation had begun to escalate. The instinctive calculation of how much force would be required to neutralize various threats and whether such force would be legally justifiable given the circumstances. These weren't thoughts that occurred to normal people in normal situations, and the fact that they'd occurred to her so automatically was a reminder that 7 months of civilian life hadn't fundamentally changed who she was or how she responded to perceived danger. She was still someone who'd been trained to survive and prevail in situations where survival and victory required skills that most people hoped never to need. But she was also someone who'd discovered that she didn't want to be defined entirely by those skills, who'd found value in work that contributed to her community without requiring her to hurt anyone, who'd enjoyed the simple pleasure of Friday evening conversations with people who saw her as a neighbor rather than as a weapon to be aimed at their problems. The question now was whether it was possible to be both versions of herself simultaneously, the person she'd been trained to be and the person she'd chosen to become. Could Sarah Martinez, community college janitor and regular customer at the Rusty Anchor, coexist with whatever classified identity was represented by the tattoo on her shoulder? Or would the exposure of one identity inevitably destroy the other? A soft knock on her apartment door interrupted Sarah's contemplation and immediately triggered the kind of heightened awareness that she'd been hoping to leave behind. It was nearly midnight on a Friday night, well past the time when social visits were appropriate, and she hadn't been expecting anyone. The knock came again, patient but persistent, the kind of sound that suggested someone who wasn't going to leave without a response. Sarah moved quietly to the window that offered a view of the external staircase leading to her door, positioning herself so that she could see without being seen. Standing on her small landing was Frank Moretti, still wearing the clothes he'd been wearing at the bar but looking somehow different in the context of her personal space. More serious, more purposeful, like someone who'd come to deliver a message rather than make a social call. Sarah considered her options quickly. She could pretend not to be home, wait for Frank to leave and deal with whatever he'd come to discuss at some later time when she was better prepared. She could answer the door but keep the conversation brief and surface level, maintaining the boundaries she'd established around her private life. Or she could acknowledge that tonight's events had changed the fundamental nature of her relationships in Riverside and engage with Frank as someone who deserved honesty about who she really was. After a moment's hesitation, she chose the third option. "It's late, Frank," Sarah said through the door, her voice quiet enough not to wake her neighbors but clear enough to be heard. "I know," Frank replied, his tone carrying the kind of respectful seriousness that she'd heard him use when dealing with difficult situations at the bar. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important. Can we talk?" Sarah unlocked the door and opened it far enough to see Frank clearly while maintaining her ability to close it quickly if necessary. He looked tired but alert, and his expression suggested someone who'd been wrestling with a difficult decision and had finally resolved to act on it. "What's on your mind?" Sarah asked, stepping aside to let him enter the apartment. Frank came inside but remained standing near the door, his posture respectful of her space while also suggesting that he understood the conversation they were about to have was significant. "I wanted to check on you," he said simply. "Make sure you're okay after what happened tonight." Sarah appreciated his concern, but she could tell that wasn't the only reason for his visit. "I'm fine," she said. "Tank made the right decision when he chose to leave rather than escalate things. Nobody got hurt." Frank nodded, but his expression remained serious. "That's not what I'm worried about," he said. "I'm worried about what happens next. Word's going to spread about what people saw tonight. Some of it will be accurate, some of it will be exaggerated, but all of it's going to make you the center of attention in ways you probably don't want." Sarah studied Frank's face, trying to determine how much he actually understood about her situation and how much he was guessing. His military service in Vietnam would have given him enough experience to recognize the significance of her tattoo, but it wouldn't necessarily have taught him about the specific units and operations that her qualifications represented. "What do you think people saw tonight?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Frank was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think they saw someone who's been trained to handle situations that most of us can't imagine," he said finally. "Someone who's probably done things in service of her country that required a lot of courage and skill. Someone who's earned the right to be left alone if that's what she wants." It was a diplomatic answer, respectful of her privacy while acknowledging that he understood more than he was saying. Sarah found herself appreciating Frank's approach, which gave her the option of sharing more information without pressuring her to do so. "The problem," Frank continued, "is that not everyone's going to see it that way. Some people are going to be curious about your story. Some are going to be impressed and want to hear war stories. Some are going to be intimidated and worried about having someone with your background living in their town. And some might see opportunities to use your skills for things you're not interested in doing." Frank's analysis was accurate enough to confirm that he understood the situation better than Sarah had initially assumed. She realized that she'd been underestimating him, just as others had been underestimating her, and that his years of running a bar that served everyone from cowboys to criminals had taught him to read people and situations with considerable skill. "So what do you think I should do?" Sarah asked, genuinely interested in his advice. "That depends," Frank said, "on whether you want to stay in Riverside or whether you're planning to disappear again." The question caught Sarah off guard, not because it was unexpected but because Frank had stated it so directly. She'd been wrestling with that exact decision all evening, and hearing it articulated by someone else forced her to confront the choice more honestly than she'd been able to do on her own. "What makes you think I've disappeared before?" she asked. Frank smiled slightly, the first time his expression had relaxed since entering her apartment. "Because you're too good at being invisible for this to be your first time. Because you've been careful about everything from where you sit to how you pay for things to what kind of questions you ask. Because you showed up in Riverside with enough money to rent an apartment and buy a truck but no employment history that anyone's been able to figure out. And because when Tank grabbed your shirt tonight, you handled the situation like someone who's had to disappear before and might need to do it again." Sarah realized that Frank's observational skills were considerably more sophisticated than she'd given him credit for. She'd been focused on avoiding attention from the kind of people who might recognize her military background, but she'd been less careful about hiding her tradecraft from someone who'd learned to notice details through decades of managing a business that attracted people who preferred not to be noticed. "You're right," Sarah said, deciding that honesty was probably the best approach at this point. This isn't the first time I've had to start over somewhere new, and it probably won't be the last. But maybe it could be, Frank said. If you wanted it to be. The suggestion hung in the air between them, representing possibilities that Sarah had been afraid to consider seriously. The idea that she might be able to stop running, might be able to build something permanent in Riverside, might be able to find a way to integrate her past with her present instead of constantly choosing between them. What would that look like? Sarah asked. Frank sat down in the chair across from hers, settling in for a longer conversation than either of them had initially anticipated. It would look like being honest with people about who you are without necessarily explaining everything you've done. It would look like letting folks know that you're someone who can be counted on in an emergency without advertising that you're available for hire. It would look like being Sarah Martinez, who happens to have an interesting background, instead of being someone who's pretending to be Sarah Martinez. It was an appealing vision, but Sarah could see the potential complications. And what happens when the wrong kind of people hear about Sarah Martinez and decide they want to recruit her for something she's not interested in doing? Then they'll discover that Sarah Martinez has friends in Riverside who aren't interested in letting anyone bother her. Frank said simply, "You think Tank backed down tonight just because he recognized your tattoo? He backed down because he realized that pushing you would mean pushing the whole community that's come to respect you. Rita Kowalski was ready to arrest him if things went bad. I was ready to ban his whole club from the bar permanently. Amy and Jake were ready to testify about what they saw if it came to legal problems." Frank leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "You've been thinking about this like you're still alone, like you have to handle everything by yourself the way you did when you were in the military. But you're not alone anymore. You've got people here who value you, who want to protect what you've built, who understand that sometimes good people have complicated pasts that are nobody else's business." Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of tension that she'd been carrying for so long that she'd forgotten it was there. The possibility that she might not have to choose between her past and her present, that she might be able to be both the person she'd been and the person she was becoming, was more appealing than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. "There's something else you should know," Frank continued. "Rita ran your name through the police databases tonight after she got home. Came up completely clean. No record of any Sarah Martinez matching your description. But she also ran it through some federal databases she has access to, and those came back with a different kind of result." Sarah's alertness spiked, her body preparing for the kind of news that might require immediate action. What kind of result? The kind that says access denied, authorized personnel only. Contact the requesting agency's security office for further information. Rita's been a cop for 10 years, and she's never seen that kind of response to a routine background check. She said it usually means someone's identity is protected at a level that requires federal intervention to access. The information confirmed what Sarah had suspected but hoped to avoid, that her carefully constructed civilian identity was backed by the kind of official protection that came with certain types of military service. But that also meant she was still connected to systems and agencies she'd been trying to leave behind. "Rita wanted you to know," Frank continued, "that she's not planning to pursue it any further. She's satisfied that you're not a danger to the community, and she respects that there might be good reasons why your background is classified. But she also wanted you to know that if anyone else starts asking questions about you, official or unofficial, she'll know about it, and she'll let you know." It was more support than Sarah had expected, and more insight into her situation than she'd realized was available through local law enforcement channels. The knowledge that Rita Kowalski was essentially providing early warning for potential threats was both comforting and concerning, since it confirmed that such threats were considered realistic possibilities. "So here's what I think," Frank said, standing up and preparing to leave. "I think you should come to the bar next Friday like you always do. I think you should order your usual 2 beers and sit in your usual booth and read your book like nothing's changed. And I think you should let people get used to the idea that Sarah Martinez is someone who deserves respect without necessarily needing to explain why." He moved toward the door, then paused. "But I also think you should be prepared for the possibility that some people might not be content to leave it at that. And if that happens,
I think you should remember that you've got friends here who don't intend to let anyone run you out of town." After Frank left, Sarah found herself sitting in her reading chair with a different relationship to the future than she'd had a few hours earlier. The exposure of her background at the Rusty Anchor had initially felt like the end of something she'd been building in Riverside, but Frank's visit had suggested that it might actually be the beginning of something more honest and sustainable. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah began to consider the possibility that she might not have to choose between being the person she'd been trained to be and the person she wanted to become. Maybe she could be both, in a place where people understood that complicated pasts didn't necessarily predict complicated futures, where respect was earned through present actions rather than past achievements. As Sarah prepared for bed, she found herself looking forward to the following Friday night at the Rusty Anchor, not because she expected it to be the same as all the previous Friday nights, but because she was curious to discover what it might become now that she no longer had to pretend to be someone she wasn't. Outside her window, Riverside slept peacefully under a sky full of stars that had witnessed countless stories of transformation and new beginnings. Sarah Martinez was ready to write the next chapter of her own story, whatever that might bring. 3 weeks had passed since the night at the Rusty Anchor when Diesel Rodriguez tore Sarah Martinez's sweater and exposed more than just her tattoo. 3 weeks during which Riverside, Montana had quietly adjusted to the knowledge that the woman who cleaned their community college classrooms and drank beer alone on Friday nights carried credentials that most people only encountered in Hollywood movies. The adjustment hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but it had been thorough, touching every corner of the small town's social fabric in ways both subtle and profound. Sarah had kept her promise to Frank Moretti, returning to the Rusty Anchor the following Friday evening with the same punctuality and routine she'd maintained for months. She'd ordered her usual 2 Coors Light bottles, settled into her familiar corner booth, and opened a paperback novel with the kind of determined normalcy that suggested she was committed to proving that exposed secrets didn't have to change fundamental relationships. But everything had changed anyway, in ways that revealed how much her quiet presence had already become woven into the community's sense of itself. The change was most obvious in how people spoke to her now. Where once her interactions had been limited to polite transactions with service workers, and the occasional nod of recognition from fellow regulars, Sarah now found herself engaged in actual conversations with people who seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and experiences. Not the intrusive curiosity she'd feared, where people would probe for details about classified operations or dramatic war stories, but the respectful interest that neighbors showed when they discovered that someone they'd known casually was more complex and accomplished than they'd initially understood. Amy Chen had been the first to bridge the gap between Sarah's old anonymity and her new visibility, stopping by her booth during a lull in the Friday evening rush to ask about the book Sarah was reading. It was a simple question that could have been answered in a few words, but Amy's genuine interest in Sarah's thoughts about the story had led to a 20-minute discussion about literature, travel, and the challenge of finding good books in a small-town library. The conversation had revealed that Amy was working on a degree in education through online courses, hoping to eventually transition from waitressing to teaching, and that she valued Sarah's perspective as someone who'd clearly seen more of the world than most Riverside residents. Jake Sullivan had overcome his initial nervousness about serving someone whose background he didn't fully understand, discovering that Sarah's military experience actually made her easier to talk to, rather than more intimidating. She never complained about slow service when the bar was busy, never demanded special attention, and never seemed impatient with the kind of minor problems that sometimes arose in food service. More importantly, she'd begun offering practical advice when Jake mentioned challenges he was facing, suggestions about dealing with difficult customers or managing his finances that came from someone who clearly understood how to solve problems efficiently and diplomatically. Frank Moretti had settled into a comfortable pattern of treating Sarah as what she'd apparently always been, a valued regular customer who happened to have an interesting background that was none of his business unless she chose to make it his business. He'd stopped by her booth occasionally to chat about current events or local news, Conversations that revealed Sarah's thoughtful analysis of political and social issues without ever requiring her to explain how she developed her perspectives. Frank had also made subtle changes to the bar's security procedures, not because he was worried about Sarah but because he was worried about people who might be interested in Sarah, and he wanted to ensure that the Rusty Anchor remained a place where everyone could drink in peace. The most significant change had come from Officer Rita Kowalski, who'd transitioned from being a customer who happened to be a cop to being something approaching a friend who took her law enforcement responsibilities seriously. Rita had made a point of stopping by Sarah's booth during her off-duty visits to the bar, not to interrogate or investigate, but to establish the kind of relationship that would allow her to provide early warning if anyone started asking official questions about Riverside's newest notable resident. These conversations had revealed that Rita was dealing with her own challenges as one of only 2 female officers in a department that wasn't always comfortable with change, and that she appreciated having someone to talk to who understood the complexities of being a woman in a profession dominated by men with traditional attitudes. But the most meaningful validation of Sarah's decision to stay in Riverside and stop running from her past had come from sources she hadn't expected. Patricia Williams from the community college had approached her during one of her night shifts, not as a supervisor checking on an employee but as an educator who'd heard rumors about Sarah's background, and wanted to explore whether she might be interested in opportunities beyond custodial work. The conversation had led to Sarah agreeing to help with a veterans support group that met monthly at the college, providing practical advice about navigating civilian life and accessing benefits without requiring her to discuss the specifics of her military service. Tom Henderson, her elderly landlord, had stopped by her apartment to deliver what he described as routine maintenance but was clearly an excuse to check on her well-being and express his appreciation for having a tenant who understood the value of security and discretion. Tom's own military service during the Korean War had been limited to stateside logistics support, but it had given him enough familiarity with military culture to recognize that Sarah's transition to civilian life had probably involved more challenges than most people realized. He'd begun leaving small improvements around her apartment and the building generally, upgrades to locks and lighting that made the space more secure without drawing attention to the changes. Even Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store had evolved from making polite small talk about the weather to asking Sarah's opinion about town issues and current events, treating her like someone whose judgment was worth considering rather than just another customer making routine purchases. These interactions had gradually revealed that Mrs. Patterson's late husband had been a Vietnam veteran who'd struggled with readjustment issues, and that she understood something about the challenges that military service could create for people trying to build civilian lives. The one relationship that had proven more complicated was with the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, whose members had been conspicuously absent from the Rusty Anchor since the night Diesel had made his dramatic mistake. Tank Rodriguez had clearly decided that avoiding potential confrontation was preferable to testing whether Sarah's calm demeanor reflected genuine peaceful intentions or simply excellent tactical discipline. But his absence from their usual hangout had created its own kind of tension in the local social ecosystem. Frank had mentioned that the Iron Wolves had been spending their Friday evenings at a bar in the next town over, about 30 miles down the highway, where they were less likely to encounter reminders of their miscalculation with Sarah. But their withdrawal from Riverside's nightlife had left a noticeable gap in the local power dynamics, creating opportunities for other groups to claim territory and influence that had previously been controlled by Tank's organization. The change wasn't necessarily negative, but it represented the kind of shift that could have unpredictable consequences for a small community's social stability. Sarah had mixed feelings about the Iron Wolves' absence from the Rusty Anchor. On one hand, their withdrawal had eliminated a potential source of ongoing tension and allowed her to enjoy her Friday evenings without constantly assessing whether Tank or his associates might decide to test her capabilities or challenge her presence in their territory. On the other hand, their absence felt like a form of victory that she hadn't particularly wanted to achieve, a reminder that her background created complications even when she was trying to live peacefully. More concerning was the possibility that Tank's organization might be spreading word about Sarah's apparent qualifications to other groups or individuals who could represent more serious threats than drunk bikers looking for someone to intimidate. The criminal networks that motorcycle clubs were often connected to included people who actively recruited individuals with specialized military training for illegal operations. And Sarah's exposed identity could attract exactly the kind of attention she'd been trying to avoid by maintaining a low profile. But Frank's promise of community protection had proven more substantial than Sarah had initially expected. Rita Kowalski had quietly reached out to law enforcement contacts in surrounding counties, providing them with Sarah's description and a request to be notified if anyone started asking questions about her or showing unusual interest in Riverside generally. The informal network of communication between small-town police departments had created an early warning system that would alert Sarah if her presence in Montana attracted attention from outside the local area. More surprisingly, several of Riverside's military veterans had made discreet contact with Sarah, not to pry into her
background, but to offer support if she needed it. Carlos from the ranch, who'd recognized the significance of her tattoo, had stopped by the college one evening to introduce himself properly, and mention that he and several other local veterans maintained informal contact with each other, sharing information about employment opportunities, benefits issues, and potential problems that might affect the veteran community. The group wasn't large or particularly organized, but it represented a network of people who understood something about military culture and were prepared to provide assistance if Sarah ever needed it. Even more unexpectedly, Sarah had discovered that Riverside's civilian community included several people with government or military connections who'd recognized the implications of her classified background check results and understood the importance of protecting her privacy. Tom Henderson's son worked for the Department of Defense in a civilian capacity and had quietly confirmed that Sarah's identity protection was backed by federal authority that would make any official investigation of her background extremely difficult and potentially career-damaging for anyone who attempted it without proper authorization. These discoveries had gradually convinced Sarah that her decision to stop running and try to build a permanent life in Riverside had been correct, not just because she was tired of constantly moving, but because she'd found a community that was capable of protecting what she valued without requiring her to explain why such protection might be necessary. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere, like she was valued for who she was rather than just what she could do. But the most significant change in Sarah's life had been internal, a shift in how she thought about herself and her relationship to her own past. For years she'd viewed her military training and experience as a burden that complicated her efforts to live peacefully, skills and knowledge that created more problems than they solved in civilian contexts. The exposure of her background at the Rusty Anchor had initially felt like a confirmation of that perspective, evidence that she couldn't escape the consequences of what she'd been trained to do. But the positive response from Riverside's community had helped her understand that her military experience could be integrated into civilian life in ways that were constructive rather than destructive, that the same skills that had made her effective in combat situations could also make her valuable in peaceful contexts. Her ability to remain calm under pressure, to assess situations quickly and accurately, to solve problems efficiently and diplomatically, were assets that could benefit her community without requiring her to engage in violence or deception. Dr. Williams had articulated this perspective most clearly during one of their conversations about the Veterans Support Group, pointing out that Sarah's combination of military experience and successful civilian transition made her uniquely qualified to help other veterans navigate similar challenges. The work wasn't glamorous or highly paid, but it was meaningful in ways that connected her past service to her present life without requiring her to compromise her values or endanger her security. Sarah had also begun to understand that her desire for anonymity, while understandable given her background, had been limiting her ability to form the kinds of relationships that made civilian life satisfying and sustainable. The friendships she'd developed with Amy, Jake, Rita, and others hadn't been possible while she was trying to remain invisible, because genuine friendship required the kind of mutual knowledge and trust that was incompatible with maintaining a completely false identity. The revelation of her military background had actually made it easier to form authentic relationships, because she no longer had to carefully monitor every conversation to avoid revealing information that might compromise her cover story. She could discuss her perspectives on current events without worrying about accidentally demonstrating knowledge that civilian contractors weren't supposed to possess. She could offer practical advice about security or problem solving without having to invent civilian sources for her expertise. She could be herself, or at least a version of herself that was honest about the fundamental experiences that had shaped her worldview. On this particular Friday evening, exactly 3 weeks after the confrontation that had changed everything, Sarah arrived at the Rusty Anchor to find the parking lot busier than usual, and the sound of conversation and laughter spilling out into the Montana night. Inside, she discovered that Frank had organized what he was calling a community appreciation evening, a celebration of the various people who contributed to Riverside's quality of life without necessarily receiving public recognition for their efforts. The event wasn't specifically about Sarah, but she quickly realized that her recent integration into the community had inspired Frank to create an opportunity for people to acknowledge and celebrate the connections that made small-town life worth preserving. The evening included recognition for Mrs. Patterson's volunteer work organizing food drives, appreciation for Tom Henderson's decades of maintaining affordable housing for working families, acknowledgement of Rita Kowalski's community policing efforts, and thanks for Dr. Williams's adult education programs. But when Frank asked Sarah to stand up so that people could express their appreciation for her work at the community college and her contributions to the Veterans Support Group, the response was more emotional than she'd expected. The applause wasn't just polite acknowledgement but genuine gratitude from people who'd come to understand that Sarah's presence in their community represented something valuable that they didn't want to lose. Amy Chen spoke for many when she said that Sarah had helped her understand that strength didn't always look like what people expected, that quiet competence was often more valuable than loud confidence, and that military service came in many forms that civilians didn't always recognize or appreciate. Jake Sullivan mentioned that Sarah's advice about handling difficult customers had made his job easier and more satisfying, while Rita Kowalski noted that having someone with Sarah's background available for consultation had helped her handle several challenging situations more effectively. But the most meaningful comment came from Carlos, the ranch worker who'd first recognized the significance of Sarah's tattoo, who stood up to say that Sarah's willingness to help with the Veterans Support Group had made it possible for several local veterans to access benefits and services they'd been struggling to navigate on their own. He pointed out that Sarah's combination of military experience and civilian success provided hope for veterans who were having difficulty with their own transitions, proof that it was possible to build meaningful lives after military service even when that service had involved experiences that were difficult to discuss or explain. As the evening continued, Sarah found herself engaged in conversations with people she'd known casually for months but was now getting to know as friends and neighbors who valued her presence in ways that went beyond her specific contributions. The change wasn't just about acceptance of her military background, but about recognition of her as a complete person whose experiences, perspectives, and skills were assets to the community regardless of where they'd been acquired. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and people began heading home to their families and weekend plans, Sarah remained in her usual booth finishing her second beer and reflecting on how much her life had changed since the night Diesel Rodriguez had grabbed her sweater. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden, but it had been thorough, touching every aspect of her daily existence in ways that made Riverside feel like home rather than just another temporary stopping place. Frank approached her booth as she was preparing to leave, carrying a manila envelope that he placed on the table beside her empty bottles. "This came for you earlier this week," he said. "Delivered to the bar instead of your apartment," which seems like someone's way of being discreet about official business. Sarah recognized the envelope's format immediately: federal government correspondence, probably from one of the agencies that maintained oversight of personnel with her classification level. The kind of communication that could represent anything from routine administrative updates to notifications of security concerns that might require immediate action. But as she opened the envelope and read the single-page letter inside, Sarah realized that this particular piece of official correspondence represented something she'd never expected to receive: formal notification that her classified service record had been updated to reflect her successful transition to civilian life and her integration into a permanent community placement. The letter explained that her identity protection would remain in place indefinitely, but that federal oversight of her activities was being reduced to routine monitoring rather than active management. More significantly, the letter included an offer of consultation work with the Department of Veterans Affairs, helping to develop programs for veterans with specialized backgrounds who were experiencing difficulty with civilian reintegration. The work would be part-time and could be performed remotely, allowing her to maintain her current life in Riverside, while contributing to efforts that aligned with her values and utilized her experience constructively. The letter was signed by someone whose name Sarah recognized from her military service, a senior officer who'd been involved in her original recruitment and training, and who apparently understood that her current situation represented exactly the kind of successful outcome that the government wanted to encourage and support rather than disrupt. As Sarah folded the letter and returned it to its envelope, she realized that her decision to stop running and build a permanent life in Riverside had been validated, not just by her local community, but by the federal agencies she'd been trying to escape. Her military past and her civilian present could coexist, could even complement each other in ways that served purposes larger than her own desire for peace and anonymity. Walking home through Riverside's quiet streets under a sky full of stars that seemed brighter than they had in years, Sarah Martinez felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the military, a sense of purpose that connected her individual life to something larger than herself, without requiring her to sacrifice the relationships and routines that made that life worth living. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from her future. She was home, in a place where both versions of herself were welcomed and valued, where her experience was an asset rather than a liability, where she could be Sarah Martinez, community college custodian and Friday evening regular at the local bar, who happened to have an interesting background that was nobody's business unless she chose to make it their business. For the first time in years, Sarah was looking forward to Monday morning, not because her work was particularly exciting, but because it was part of a life that felt authentic and sustainable and connected to a community that had proven itself worthy of her trust and commitment. She was ready to discover what came next, confident that whatever challenges or opportunities arose, she would face them as herself, supported by people who understood that the best lives were built on foundations of mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Sarah Martinez stood behind the podium at Riverside Community College's graduation ceremony, watching Amy Chen walk across the stage to receive her associate degree in elementary education. The applause from the small but enthusiastic crowd reflected the pride that the entire community felt when one of their own achieved something meaningful, but Sarah's satisfaction went deeper than simple neighborly support. Amy's success represented the kind of positive outcome that justified all the complications and risks that came with choosing to build a life in one place instead of constantly moving to stay ahead of potential problems. The graduation ceremony was being held in the college's multi-purpose room, the same space where Sarah had spent countless nights mopping floors and emptying trash cans while listening to the echoes of her own footsteps in the empty building. But tonight the room was filled with families and friends, celebrating achievements that represented years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination. Sarah had been invited not as a custodial employee but as a volunteer coordinator for the Veterans Support Services program, a role that had evolved naturally from her informal mentoring work with individual students and community members. Patricia Williams had formalized Sarah's position after the Veterans Support Group had grown from a monthly gathering of 3 or 4 people to a weekly program that served veterans from 3 counties. The work involved helping veterans navigate benefit applications, providing referrals to mental health and career services, and facilitating workshops on topics ranging from financial planning to small business development. It wasn't work that required Sarah to discuss the specifics of her own military experience, but it allowed her to use the practical knowledge she'd gained from her own transition to civilian life. More importantly,
The position had given Sarah a sense of purpose that connected her individual life to something larger than herself, without requiring her to compromise the peaceful existence she'd built in Riverside. She was helping people solve real problems and achieve concrete goals, work that felt meaningful in ways that her previous attempts at civilian employment had never achieved. The combination of her custodial job, which provided financial stability and flexible scheduling, with her volunteer work, which provided intellectual engagement and social contribution, had created the kind of balanced life that she'd been seeking without knowing exactly what it would look like. Amy's graduation was particularly meaningful because it represented the successful completion of a goal that had seemed impossible when Amy first approached Sarah for advice about managing work, family responsibilities, and online coursework simultaneously. Amy's 8-year-old daughter had required constant attention. While Amy was trying to study, her waitressing job at the Rusty Anchor provided a regular income that made financial planning difficult, and the online format of her education program had left her feeling isolated and unsupported. Sarah had helped Amy develop time management strategies, study techniques, and stress management approaches that had made it possible to succeed academically while maintaining her other responsibilities. But Sarah's assistance had gone beyond practical advice to include the kind of emotional support that came from someone who understood what it meant to rebuild your life around new goals and priorities. Amy's decision to pursue a teaching career had required her to step outside her comfort zone, to believe in possibilities that hadn't seemed realistic when she was focused primarily on immediate survival. Sarah's own experience of transitioning from military service to civilian life had given her insights into the psychological challenges of major life changes that proved valuable for someone navigating a different but equally significant transformation. The success of Amy's academic program had also created opportunities for Riverside residents who were interested in pursuing education or career changes, but weren't sure how to manage the practical challenges. Sarah had helped establish informal study groups, connected people with similar goals, and provided encouragement for individuals who were considering changes that seemed overwhelming when approached alone. The Veterans Support Program had expanded to include services for anyone in the community who was dealing with major life transitions, creating a resource that served broader needs while maintaining its focus on veteran-specific issues. As the graduation ceremony concluded, and families gathered for the reception in the college's cafeteria, Sarah found herself surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her work in ways that went far beyond her original intentions. Carlos, the ranch worker, who'd first recognized the significance of her tattoo, had completed a certification program in heavy equipment operation that had led to a promotion and a significant salary increase. Rita Kowalski had used Sarah's assistance to navigate the application process for a federal law enforcement training program that would expand her career opportunities while allowing her to remain in Riverside. Tom Henderson's grandson had received help with college applications and financial aid forms that had made it possible for him to attend the state university on a partial scholarship. But perhaps the most significant success story was Jake Sullivan, who'd used Sarah's encouragement and practical guidance to enroll in a business management program that was preparing him to eventually take over operation of the Rusty Anchor when Frank Moretti decided to retire. Jake's transformation from a young man who'd never considered possibilities beyond his high school job to someone who was actively planning a career in hospitality management demonstrated the kind of positive impact that supportive mentoring could have on people who simply needed someone to believe their potential. The reception provided an opportunity for Sarah to catch up with various community members whose lives had intersected with hers in meaningful ways over the months since her background had been revealed. Frank Moretti approached her with a beer and a grin, clearly pleased with how the evening's celebration had highlighted the positive changes that had occurred in Riverside's social fabric since Sarah had become more actively involved in community life. "You know," Frank said, settling into a chair beside Sarah's table, "when I first saw that tattoo of yours, I was worried about what kind of complications it might bring to our little town. I never imagined it would end up making things better for so many people." Sarah appreciated Frank's perspective, but she understood that her military background had been less important than her willingness to engage with people's actual needs and challenges. The skills she'd developed during her service had certainly been useful, but the real value had come from her commitment to helping others succeed, rather than simply avoiding problems herself. The tattoo didn't make anything better, Sarah replied. What made things better was people deciding to trust each other and work together toward goals that benefited everyone. My background just happened to include some experiences that were relevant to the challenges people were facing. Frank nodded, but his expression suggested that he understood the situation differently. Maybe so, but it took someone with your particular combination of skills and perspective to see the opportunities and figure out how to address them effectively. Not everyone would have been able to do what you've done here. The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Williams, who approached with a folder of documents and the kind of purposeful expression that suggested official business rather than social conversation. As the college's continuing education coordinator, Dr. Williams had been instrumental in formalizing many of the support services that Sarah had helped develop, and she'd become both a professional colleague and a personal friend whose judgment Sarah respected. I have some news that might interest you, Dr. Williams said, taking a seat at their table. The Department of Veterans Affairs has approved funding for a regional Veterans Transition Center, and they've asked if Riverside Community College would be interested in hosting the program. The center would serve veterans from a 5-county area and would provide comprehensive services, including education, career training, mental health support, and benefits assistance. The proposal represented a significant expansion of the work Sarah had been doing on a volunteer basis, potentially creating full-time employment opportunities, while dramatically increasing the resources available to veterans throughout rural Montana. But it also represented the kind of visibility and official attention that Sarah had spent years trying to avoid, and she felt the familiar tension between her desire to contribute meaningfully to her community and her need to maintain control over her own life and security. Dr. Williams seemed to understand Sarah's hesitation, because she continued with information that addressed some of the obvious concerns. The position they're offering you would be as a program coordinator, rather than a director, which means you'd be working with veterans directly, rather than dealing with federal oversight or administrative bureaucracy. Your background check has already been completed through your previous clearance levels, so there wouldn't be any additional investigation or publicity. And the salary would be competitive with similar positions in larger cities, which means you could focus entirely on the work instead of having to maintain multiple jobs. The offer was appealing in ways that Sarah hadn't expected, representing an opportunity to do work that felt genuinely important, while maintaining the lifestyle and relationships she'd built in Riverside. But she also understood that accepting such a position would represent a significant commitment to remaining in Montana permanently, giving up the option of disappearing and starting over somewhere else if circumstances made that necessary. Frank, who'd been listening to the conversation with obvious interest, provided the perspective that helped Sarah understand how the decision connected to her broader goals and values. Sounds like they're offering you a chance to do officially what you've already been doing unofficially, he said. The question is whether you're ready to stop keeping one foot out the door and commit fully to being part of this community. His observation was accurate enough to make Sarah uncomfortable, because it highlighted the extent to which her planning and decision-making were still influenced by assumptions about impermanence that might no longer be relevant to her actual situation. She'd been so focused on maintaining the option of leaving Riverside that she hadn't fully considered what it would mean to commit to staying, to build a life that was designed for longevity, rather than mobility. Over the following weeks, as Sarah considered the Veterans Center opportunity and what it would mean for her future, she found herself reflecting on how much her perspective on risk and security had changed since the night her anonymity had been shattered at the Rusty Anchor. The exposure she'd feared as a catastrophic threat to her safety and well-being had actually created opportunities for more authentic relationships and more meaningful work than she'd experienced since leaving the military. The federal letter she'd received months earlier had confirmed that her identity protection remained in place, and that official oversight of her activities had been reduced to routine monitoring rather than active management. But more importantly, her integration into Riverside's community had created informal security networks that were in many ways more reliable than the official protections she'd been depending on. Rita Kowalski's law enforcement connections provided early warning about potential threats from outside the area. Frank Moretti's position in the local business community ensured that any unusual interest in Sarah would be noticed and reported. The veterans support network she'd helped build included people with various skills and connections who understood the importance of protecting what they'd helped create. Perhaps most significantly, Sarah had come to understand that the anonymous, mobile lifestyle she'd been living since leaving the military had actually made her more vulnerable, rather than more secure, because it had isolated her from the kinds of relationships and community connections that provided genuine protection against the various forms of danger that people faced in civilian life. Her attempts to remain invisible had left her dependent entirely on her own resources and judgment, without the backup and support that came from being part of a community that valued her presence and would act to protect her if necessary. The decision to accept the Veterans Center position represented more than just a career choice. It was a decision to trust that the life she'd built in Riverside was worth the risks that came with permanence and visibility. After months of testing whether she could integrate her military past with her civilian present, Sarah was ready to commit fully to a future that honored both aspects of her identity, while serving purposes larger than her own security and comfort. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 7 months after Diesel Rodriguez had made his dramatic mistake at the Rusty Anchor, Sarah Martinez walked into the newly established Riverside Regional Veterans Transition Center to begin her first day as a full-time program coordinator. The center occupied space in a renovated building on Main Street, just 3 blocks from the Rusty Anchor and 2 blocks from her apartment, placing her work literally at the heart of the community that had become her home. The building itself had been transformed from a vacant retail space into a welcoming facility that included individual counseling offices, group meeting rooms, computer workstations for online services, and a resource library stocked with information about benefits, education, and career opportunities. But the most important feature was a comfortable lounge area where veterans could gather informally, share experiences, and provide mutual support without the structure and pressure of formal programming. As Sarah prepared for the center's official opening ceremony, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her from the anonymous woman in the corner booth of a Montana bar to someone whose work was making a measurable difference in people's lives. The transformation hadn't been planned or anticipated, but it had grown naturally from her willingness to engage authentically with her community's needs and her community's willingness to accept and support someone whose background was complex and partially unknown. The opening ceremony attracted visitors from throughout the region, including federal officials who traveled from Washington to celebrate the launch of a program that represented innovative approaches to rural veteran services. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came when Amy Chen, now working as a substitute teacher in Riverside's elementary school, brought her daughter to tour the center and thanked Sarah for the support that had made Amy's career change possible. Standing in the center's main room, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the work she'd helped develop, Sarah Martinez felt something she'd never experienced during her military service: the satisfaction of contributing to her community's well-being in ways that created lasting positive change without requiring secrecy or sacrifice of personal relationships. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from her future, but building something permanent and meaningful that honored both her service and her humanity. As the ceremony concluded and the center prepared to begin its regular operations, Sarah looked out the window at Riverside's familiar streets and felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she'd done or what she might be capable of doing. For the first time since leaving the military, she was home in every sense that mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.